So Canada just made a trade move that has Washington in absolute panic. And Donald Trump was so rattled by it that he flew to Ottawa to confront Mark Carney in person. Not a phone call, not an envoy. The President of the United States got on Air Force One and flew to Canada to sit across the table from the man who just upended the entire economic relationship between the two countries. The Canadian Trade Sovereignty Act went into effect at midnight. No warning, no phase-in, no 90-day grace period. Overnight, Canada legally redirected the flow of hundreds of billions of dollars in energy, minerals, and commodities away from the United States and toward Europe, Japan, and the United Kingdom at preferential prices the U.S. can't match. Warren Buffett called it the single most consequential trade action by a middle power in modern economic history, and then explained why the United States has no legal way to stop it. But here's what makes this truly unprecedented. When Trump and Carney sat down in Ottawa, Carney laid out one offer, one path to slow this down, one clear deal. Trump said no. And what Carney said publicly after that meeting, standing at a podium less than 30 minutes later with the cameras rolling, is the reason this story is about to dominate every news cycle for the next month. Hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what comes next. Let me walk you through exactly what Canada did, because once you understand the specifics, you'll understand why Washington is in a state of genuine panic. Mark Carney addressed the Canadian public at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The speech lasted 12 minutes. It was calm, it was measured, it was devastating. He framed the entire thing not as retaliation, not as a counterpunch against Trump's tariffs, but as an act of sovereignty. His exact words, "Canada will no longer allow its economic future to depend on the decisions of a single trading partner. We are a sovereign nation, and sovereign nations diversify." That framing was deliberate and brilliant. By calling it sovereignty instead of retaliation, he made it nearly impossible for Trump to frame it as an attack. You can't accuse a country of attacking you when all they're doing is diversifying their customer base. That's just business. The act was introduced in Parliament, debated, passed, and received royal assent in a single day. That doesn't happen by accident. Carney had quietly secured cross-party support weeks in advance. Every major party backed it. The legislation was ready, the votes were counted, and the world only found out when it was already law. The act has 4 pillars, and each one is more devastating than the last. First, mandatory diversification quotas. Under the new law, no more than 50% of any Canadian commodity category can go to a single trading partner. That sounds like a neutral policy, and legally it is. It applies equally to every country on Earth. But in practice, it's a guided missile aimed directly at the United States. Right now, the U.S. receives 70 to 80% of Canadian oil exports, lumber, minerals, agricultural products. Under the new quotas, that number has to drop to 50%. Which means hundreds of billions of dollars in trade that used to flow south will now flow east to Europe, to Asia, to anyone but America. Second, preferential pricing for diversified partners. Countries that have signed bilateral trade framework agreements with Canada under the new system get preferred pricing on Canadian commodities, 8 to 12% below the rate offered to the United States. The EU signed a framework agreement the day the act was announced. Japan signed within hours. The UK signed the following morning. South Korea signed within 72 hours. These weren't rushed deals cobbled together in response to the announcement. They were pre-negotiated, ready to go, waiting in a drawer for the moment Carney gave the word, which means while Trump was focused on tariffs and trade threats, Carney was quietly building an entirely new customer base, one that now gets Canadian resources at a discount that American manufacturers cannot access. Third, critical minerals export licensing. All Canadian exports of lithium, nickel, cobalt, potash, and uranium now require federal export licenses. That alone would be significant. But here's the detail that terrified the Pentagon. Licenses for U.S.-bound shipments are subject to what the Act calls national interest review. That's a bureaucratic process with no defined timeline. It's not a ban. It's something worse than a ban. It's uncertainty. Companies can't plan production schedules when they don't know if their mineral shipments will arrive next month or next year. And uncertainty in manufacturing is more destructive than a straightforward cutoff. Fourth, energy export recalibration. Canadian oil and natural gas exports to the United States will be reduced by 15% over 18 months. The volume that used to go south through existing pipelines will be redirected to new LNG terminals being built on Canada's Atlantic and Pacific coast for export to Europe and Asia. The buyers are already lined up, the terminal construction is already underway, the contracts are already signed. Each pillar alone would be significant. Together, they represent the most comprehensive trade restructuring by any nation in the Western Hemisphere since NAFTA was negotiated 3 decades ago. And here's the part that has Washington most unsettled. This is entirely legal. The diversification quotas don't violate WTO rules because they apply to all trading partners equally. The preferential pricing is structured through bilateral agreements that are standard under international trade law. The export licensing is a sovereign right that every nation possesses, and the energy recalibration happens over 18 months with advance notice. Carney's legal team built this to be bulletproof. There's no international tribunal to appeal to, no trade court that can override it, no executive order that can undo it. It's done. The reason Washington didn't see it coming is itself part of the story. U.S. intelligence and trade monitoring was focused entirely on the obvious response, retaliatory tariffs. That's what every analyst predicted. That's what every think tank modeled. That's what every trade publication speculated about. And while everyone was watching for retaliatory tariffs, Carney was building something far more consequential. The legal framework was drafted in secrecy by a small team inside the Prime Minister's office reporting directly to Carney. The coordination with the EU, Japan, and the UK happened through Carney's personal diplomatic channels, not through the normal trade representative channels that the US routinely monitors. Washington was watching the front door. Carney came through the basement, and when Washington finally understood what had happened, the reaction was unlike anything we've seen from this administration. Trump reportedly learned about the act from cable news. Not from his intelligence briefing, not from his trade team, not from the State Department, not from the NSA, from television. His first reaction, according to multiple aides who were in the room, was, "He can't do that." And then his advisors had to explain to him that legally, Carney absolutely can. Every element of the act falls within Canada's sovereign authority. An emergency National Security Council meeting was called within 2 hours. The Pentagon was represented because critical minerals supply directly affects defense manufacturing. The Treasury Department sent a representative. The Commerce Secretary dialed in from overseas. Trump demanded what he always demands: maximum pressure. Hit them with everything. But for the first time, his team couldn't identify effective leverage. They went around the room. Tariffs? Already in place. And clearly the tariffs are what provoked this in the first place. Imposing more tariffs on a country that's actively diversifying away from you is like threatening to fire a client who's already quit. Sanctions? You can't sanction a NATO ally and Five Eyes intelligence partner without destroying a dozen other alliances simultaneously. Every sanctions regime depends on allied cooperation, and the allies are the ones signing trade deals with Canada. Military pressure? On Canada? The suggestion was apparently raised and immediately dismissed as absurd. Diplomatic isolation? Canada just signed framework agreements with the EU, Japan, and the UK. It's the opposite of isolated. For the first time in this administration, they confronted a problem they couldn't bully, threaten, or executive order their way out of. Every tool in the box either wouldn't work or would make things worse. The Pentagon's reaction was the most urgent and the least political. 60% of U.S. rare earth processing depends on Canadian-sourced minerals. That's not a talking point. That's a structural dependency baked into every major defense program the country operates. The F-35 fighter jet program requires Canadian nickel for its engine components. Submarine battery systems depend on Canadian cobalt. Missile guidance systems use processed lithium that originates in Canadian mines. Advanced radar arrays for the Navy's next-generation destroyers require rare earth elements that flow through Canadian processing facilities. Every single one of those supply chains is now subject to Canadian export licensing and national interest review. A senior defense official told Reuters off the record, "This is not a trade issue. This is a national security emergency. We are talking about the ability to manufacture weapon systems that the United States military depends on for force projection around the globe." The Pentagon immediately requested direct communication with Ottawa's Department of National Defense, bypassing the White House entirely. That detail is extraordinary. The U.S. military establishment went around its own commander-in-chief to talk directly to a foreign government's defense ministry. They weren't interested in Trump's political fight with Carney. They were interested in whether they could still build fighter jets next quarter, whether submarine production would stall, whether missile stockpile replenishment could continue. The defense establishment understood something that the political establishment was still trying to spin. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was real. Corporate America's reaction was even more revealing. Energy companies launched an immediate lobbying blitz on Congress and the White House because the 15% oil reduction means higher input costs for every refinery on the Gulf Coast and across the Midwest. Pipeline operators who had spent decades building north-south infrastructure suddenly found that infrastructure pointed in the wrong direction. Auto manufacturers scrambled to assess the damage because Canadian aluminum and steel supply uncertainty threatens the just-in-time manufacturing systems that the entire industry depends on. A single missed shipment can shut down an assembly line. A sustained reduction in supply can shut down a factory. Tech companies panicked over battery supply chains. The critical minerals licensing creates existential doubt about the lithium and cobalt supply for electric vehicles, smartphones, laptops, and data center hardware. Every major cloud computing company runs on servers that require minerals. Canada just put behind a licensing wall. The stock market dropped 400 points within hours of the announcement. Energy sector stocks were hit hardest, with major producers falling 5 to 8% in a single trading session. And the CEO of a major energy company went on CNBC and said something that cut through all the political noise: "We need Canadian oil. There is no replacement at this volume on this timeline, period." Anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't understand how refineries work. The business lobby that had cheered Trump's tariffs, that had applauded the tough-on-trade posture, that had celebrated the idea of using economic pressure to extract concessions from allies, suddenly realized those tariffs had provoked something they couldn't undo with a phone call to the White House. You can't undiversify a nation's trade policy once the framework agreements are signed and the construction crews are pouring concrete for LNG terminals. And then Warren Buffett weighed in. And what he said reframed the entire conversation. Buffett's comments came from a private investors' dinner. They leaked within hours because everyone in that room understood the significance of what they were hearing. Buffett said, "What Canada just did is what I've spent my career doing to undervalued companies. They identified a dependency, they quantified it, and they leveraged it. The only difference is I do it with stocks. Carney did it with a nation." He went further. He said that for 50 years, the United States has treated Canadian resources as a given. Free-flowing oil, cheap minerals, reliable lumber, endless freshwater access. America built its entire industrial supply chain around the assumption that Canada would always be there, always be cheap, and never have options. Carney just proved all three assumptions wrong, Buffett said, simultaneously. Then he addressed the tariffs directly. The tariffs were supposed to bring Canada to heel. Instead, they gave Canada a reason to do what any smart business does when a major client turns abusive: find new clients. And they found them. The EU, Japan, the UK, South Korea. They were all waiting for this call. Canada didn't jump into the unknown. Canada jumped into a net that was already built. Buffett's structural warning was the part that made Wall Street truly nervous. He said this isn't something you reverse with a phone call or even a trade deal. Canada has signed framework agreements with the EU, Japan, the UK, and South Korea. Those aren't memorandums of understanding. Those are binding commercial agreements with pricing structures, volume commitments, and delivery timelines. LNG terminals are under construction on both coasts. Billions of dollars in concrete and steel already poured. Export licensing infrastructure is operational and staffed with trained bureaucrats who aren't going to be disbanded because Washington asks nicely. This is structural, he said. The architecture of North American trade has been permanently altered, and structural changes don't respond to political pressure. They respond to economic reality. You can't tweet your way out of a pipeline that now points east instead of south. He noted that Berkshire Hathaway has significant energy holdings that depend on Canadian crude refineries, pipeline stakes, utility companies that burn Canadian natural gas. He's already instructed his portfolio managers to stress test every position for reduced Canadian supply over an 18-month horizon. He's reviewing alternative sourcing for every Berkshire subsidiary that touches Canadian inputs. "I'm not waiting for Washington to fix this," he said. "I stopped waiting for Washington to fix things about 2 years ago. My job is to protect my shareholders, and right now that means assuming Canadian supply to the United States will be lower tomorrow than it is today, every day, for the foreseeable future." And then someone at the dinner asked Buffett the question that everyone in America should be asking: can the United States survive without Canadian resources? His answer was precise and characteristically blunt. The answer is yes, the United States can survive without Canadian resources. We survived before Canada was a major supplier, and we'd survive if they stopped exporting entirely. The question is at what cost, over what timeline, and with what damage in the interim. And right now, nobody in Washington has good answers to any of those three questions. Not the White House, not the Pentagon, not Congress, nobody. The United States just learned what every business owner learns eventually. When you treat your best supplier like they're disposable, one day they prove you wrong. Now, the meeting. Trump demanded a face-to-face with Carney within 48 hours of the announcement. The demand itself was revealing. That kind of urgency signals weakness, and every diplomat in the world recognized it. Carney agreed to the meeting, but he insisted on Ottawa. Not Washington, not Camp David, not some neutral third location. Ottawa, the Canadian capital, home turf. Trump's team pushed back hard. A sitting U.S. president doesn't fly to another country to negotiate on the other leader's terms. It violates protocol. It sends a message of desperation. But the domestic pressure was overwhelming. Energy company CEOs were calling the White House directly. Defense contractors were warning of production shutdowns within months. Manufacturing associations were threatening public statements. Trump had no choice. He flew to Ottawa, and that optics told the story before a single word was spoken. The President of the United States flew to Canada, not to negotiate from strength, to negotiate from need. The meeting was held at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier, overlooking Parliament Hill. Both delegations were kept small, 4 people on each side. Carney brought his foreign minister, trade minister, and chief of staff. Trump brought the Secretary of State, the trade representative, and the national security advisor. No press in the room, no cameras, no microphones, just 8 people, and what multiple officials on both sides have called the most consequential bilateral conversation between these two nations since NAFTA was negotiated. What we know about what happened inside comes from officials briefed on both sides. And crucially, the Canadian and American accounts of the meeting don't match. Trump reportedly opened aggressively. "Mark, you need to reverse this. You're making a huge mistake. This is going to hurt Canada more than it hurts us." Standard Trump dominance framing. The assumption that volume and confidence can substitute for leverage. According to officials present on the Canadian side, Carney didn't argue. He didn't posture. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match Trump's energy. He opened a binder, a physical binder, printed charts, data tables, projections that he'd brought with him to the table. In the age of digital presentations and teleprompters, Carney chose paper, something Trump could see, touch, and couldn't dismiss as a screen glitch. He walked Trump through exactly how U.S. tariffs had damaged Canadian industries over the past 18 months, sector by sector, province by province, job losses in Ontario manufacturing, export revenue declines in Alberta energy, factory closures in Quebec aerospace, fishing community devastation in the Maritimes, farm revenue collapses in Saskatchewan, community by community impact, all of it documented with granular, inarguable precision. He wasn't making an emotional appeal, he was presenting an audit. And audits don't care about your feelings. Then Carney flipped to the second section of the binder. Projections. Canada's economic future under the diversification framework, new trade volumes with the EU, projected to increase by 40% within 3 years. Revenue from preferential pricing agreements with Japan, billions annually in mineral exports alone. Critical minerals demand from South Korea for their semiconductor and battery industries. LNG export revenue from the new Atlantic and Pacific terminals that would make Canada a top 5 global energy exporter by the end of the decade. He showed Trump 2 futures side by side on paper, one where Canada stays dependent on a hostile trading partner who uses tariffs as a weapon whenever it suits him politically, and one where Canada builds a diversified economy that no single nation can threaten or destabilize. And the second future, the one without the United States at the center, was better by every single metric. Higher GDP growth, more stable employment, greater energy revenue, stronger diplomatic positioning, less vulnerability. Trump reportedly pushed back. "Those numbers are fantasy. You need us more than we need you." And Carney's response, according to multiple officials who were in the room, was 6 words that may end up defining the entire trade conflict between these two nations. That was true 18 months ago. He let the silence hang. The room was quiet. Then he continued, his voice measured and even. "It's not true anymore. And every day your tariffs remain in place, it becomes less true. You are accelerating Canada's independence from the United States, and you're doing it at your own expense." Then came the offer. Carney laid out one path forward. Canada would pause implementation of the diversification quotas and energy recollaboration for 120 days. 4 months, a cooling-off period. But the condition was absolute. The United States would remove all tariffs on Canadian goods within 30 days. Not reduced, not modified, not subjected to a review process, removed, completely. The critical minerals licensing would remain regardless. Carney called it a sovereign prerogative that was non-negotiable under any circumstances. Trump reportedly said, "I can't do that. You know I can't do that." Carney. Then we have nothing more to discuss on this topic. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes on other bilateral issues, border security, Arctic cooperation, NATO coordination. But the central question, the trade move that brought the President of the United States to Ottawa in the first place, was settled in that exchange. Trump couldn't reverse his tariffs without looking weak to his base. Carney wouldn't reverse the act without the tariffs gone. and neither man was willing to blink. Trump wanted Carney to fold. Carney had decided before he walked into the room that he wouldn't, and Trump had no plan, none at all, for what to do if Carney held firm. What happened after the meeting was arguably more damaging than the meeting itself, and this is really the moment that defined the entire confrontation. Trump emerged first. He stood in front of the cameras in the hotel lobby, flanked by the Secretary of State and the trade representative, and said what he always says. Very productive meeting. Great relationship with Canada. We're making tremendous progress. Mark and I had a very good discussion, very positive. We'll have more to say soon. Vague, optimistic, empty of any specific detail. The standard Trump post-meeting performance, designed to control the narrative before the other side speaks. He took no questions. He walked to the motorcade. The American press corps was left with nothing but platitudes. Then, 30 minutes later, Carney held his own press conference. And he didn't do what most world leaders do after a difficult bilateral meeting, which is issue a bland diplomatic statement about constructive dialogue and mutual understanding and continuing to work together on shared challenges. He did the opposite. He was specific. Devastatingly, surgically specific. He told the press exactly what he'd offered. He told them the precise terms: remove all tariffs within 30 days, and Canada pauses implementation for 120 days. He told them Trump's response, and he told them what happens next. I offered the president a clear path, Carney said, standing at the podium with the Canadian flag behind him and Parliament Hill visible through the windows. Remove the tariffs, and we slow the transition. He chose not to take it. Canada will proceed as planned. That single statement destroyed Trump's narrative completely, because productive meeting and tremendous progress don't survive contact with I made him an offer and he said no. Everyone watching, every journalist, every analyst, every voter, every CEO now had the specific facts. They knew what was on the table, they knew who refused it, and they could draw their own conclusions. The impact was immediate and brutal. Because now every American who pays higher energy prices knows Trump had a way out. Every manufacturer who can't get critical minerals on time knows there was a deal available. Every defense contractor scrambling for supply. Every consumer facing higher costs at the pump and in the store. Every worker whose factory is talking about shutdowns because of supply chain disruptions. They all know that Carney put a clear, simple, actionable deal on the table. And Trump said no. The consequences that follow are no longer Canada's choice. They're Trump's choice. Canada offered an off-ramp. Trump drove past it. He had a chance to fix it. He said no. The fallout since the meeting has been swift and unforgiving. Energy markets spiked within hours of Carney's press conference. U.S. crude prices rose as traders priced in reduced Canadian supply over the next 18 months. Critical minerals futures surged as manufacturers rushed to secure stockpiles. The Canadian dollar strengthened, a clear signal that international markets believe the diversification strategy will succeed. U.S. industrial stocks dropped across the board. Auto, energy, tech, defense, all of them hit. The market rendered its verdict before the politicians could spin the story. On the international stage, the acceleration was even more striking. The European Union fast-tracked ratification of its framework agreement with Canada, a process that normally takes months compressed into days. Japan's trade minister held a joint press conference with Canada's trade minister within days, announcing expanded cooperation on critical minerals and energy, unusual diplomatic speed that signals strategic urgency, not polite formality. The United Kingdom announced expanded LNG import capacity specifically designed for Canadian natural gas, with the British Energy Secretary calling the agreement a generational opportunity to secure Britain's energy independence. South Korea's largest steel manufacturer signed a long-term procurement agreement for Canadian aluminum within the week. The world wasn't surprised by Canada's move. The world was waiting for it. The framework agreements were ready. The terminal capacity was planned. The buyers were lined up. And every one of those buyers had been watching the U.S.-Canada trade war with growing excitement, because they understood something that Washington still hasn't fully processed. When a superpower bullies its best supplier, the supplier's other potential customers benefit enormously. The EU gets cheaper Canadian energy than America. Japan gets preferred access to critical minerals. The UK gets LNG at below market rates. Canada didn't leap into darkness. Canada leapt into a net that had been carefully woven for months by partners eager to catch them. Back in the United States, American industry stopped waiting for Trump to fix the problem. Multiple CEOs of major energy and manufacturing companies have quietly requested direct meetings with Carney's office, bypassing the White House entirely. They want to negotiate their own arrangements with Canada, their own supply guarantees, their own pricing structures, Some are even exploring whether they can establish Canadian subsidiaries to access resources from inside the Canadian market, circumventing the export licensing regime altogether. The fact that American business leaders are going directly to Ottawa instead of calling the West Wing tells you everything about where the real power sits now. The corporate establishment has made a calculation. Trump can't fix this, and waiting for him to try is costing them money every day. Republican senators from energy-producing states are demanding answers from the White House. Senators from Alaska, Texas, North Dakota, and Louisiana, states that either compete with Canadian energy or depend on it for refining, are publicly calling for a policy reversal. Trump's approval ratings have dropped in Rust Belt and industrial states, the exact voters he promised to protect with tariffs, the exact communities that are now facing higher energy costs and supply chain disruptions because of those same tariffs. Democrats are framing the entire situation with a devastatingly simple message: Trump provoked this and then he couldn't fix it. And an internal White House memo leaked to the Washington Post contained a sentence that may be the most honest assessment anyone in this administration has produced. We have no viable countermeasure that doesn't cause more damage than it prevents. Think about that sentence. The White House's own internal analysis concludes that every tool they have would make the situation worse. That's not a policy disagreement, that's checkmate. The tariffs were supposed to be Trump's greatest trade achievement, the proof that economic pressure works, the demonstration that America can bend any nation to its will through sheer market dominance. Instead, those tariffs provoked the most significant loss of American trade leverage since the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s. And the man who engineered that loss isn't some hostile adversary on the other side of the globe. It's the Prime Minister of the country next door, a former central banker who saw the dependency, quantified it, and used it. So here's where we stand. Canada passed the Trade Sovereignty Act, mandatory diversification quotas, preferential pricing for allied nations, critical minerals export licensing, and a 15% reduction in energy exports to the United States over the next 18 months. Washington panicked. The Pentagon called it a national security emergency and bypassed the White House to talk directly to Ottawa. Buffett called it the inevitable consequence of treating your best supplier as disposable. American CEOs stopped calling the White House and started calling the Canadian Prime Minister's office. Trump flew to Ottawa, sat across from Carney in a room with no cameras, and was offered one clear path out: remove all tariffs within 30 days. He said no. And Carney told the world exactly what happened. This is no longer about tariffs. It stopped being about tariffs the moment Canada signed framework agreements with the EU, Japan, and the UK. It stopped being about tariffs the moment construction crews broke ground on LNG terminals that will pump Canadian energy across the Atlantic and Pacific for decades to come. It's about whether the United States can afford the consequences of a trade policy that turned its most reliable partner into its most strategic competitor. Canada didn't want this fight. Canada wanted to sell oil and minerals and lumber to its neighbor at fair prices under a stable framework. That's all it ever wanted. For decades, that's exactly what it did. Reliably, affordably, without drama. Instead, it got tariffs, threats, insults, and the clear message that the United States considered Canadian resources an entitlement rather than a partnership, that America could take whatever it wanted at whatever price it dictated, and Canada would just accept it because it had nowhere else to go. So Canada built somewhere else to go. An alternative with preferential pricing, binding framework agreements, LNG terminals under construction, and a lineup of eager buyers stretching from London to Tokyo to Seoul. 3 questions remain, and nobody in Washington has answers to any of them. Can American industry survive the transition period, the months or years before alternative supply chains are built, without Canadian resources at current volumes and current prices? Will Trump reverse the tariffs to stop the bleeding, or will pride prevent him from taking the deal that's still sitting on Carney's table in Ottawa? And the question Buffett posed that nobody in Washington seems willing to confront honestly: what happens when your best supplier finds better customers? Canada made its move. Trump had his chance. The offer is still on the table. But every day it sits there unanswered. The world Canada is building without the United States gets a little more permanent. And permanent has a way of becoming irreversible.